All right, well, this week we are very happy to have Fred Balin with us. Fred is a resident of College Terrace neighborhood who has long been involved in this issue of underground toxins in the area. So Fred, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Fred, you've been in the neighborhood for 25 years, I believe you said?
Yes.
And College Terrace, for those who don't know, is located west of El Camino, adjacent to Stanford and the Stanford Research Park. And there have been issues resulting in the industrial park's use of chemicals and the migration of those chemicals into the ground, which you were first alerted to. You said it was in the early 2000s, is that right?
Well, there's a long history of hazardous materials within the research park throughout Palo Alto, not just next to College Terrace. When most projects come up for redevelopment in Research Park, there has to be an environmental study done to see what's in the ground. There are hazardous material sites in different parts of the research park. We have underground plumes that are going through several areas. There are several Superfund sites. So it's an ongoing issue, especially now where a lot of the old infrastructure in Research Park is being replaced. There's ground leases have come up after 50 years. Things are aging. Things are being redeveloped. So
replaced with either commercial or housing.
Housing now for the first time in the Mayfield development, yes.
So I'm just curious, for those who don't know, how exactly did the chemicals get into the ground? Was it intentionally stored there, or was there a leaking of tanks, or do we have a good grasp on
Good question. We don't exactly know. The reports say that there was a plating sump where, let's say, semiconductors or other types of technical instruments were cleaned, and it may have leaked from there, and that goes back decades.
Wow.
The original tenant was Granger and Associates back in the 60s, then HP for a number of decades. They say the sump wasn't theirs. However, they had a big chemical storage area that had hundreds of gallons of TCE stored in there over the years. So something may have come from there. So it's not definitive, but from two general areas, it either came from the plating sump that goes way back when, or the chemical storage area years later.
Okay. And we're talking about some parcels that are now being redeveloped as housing along California Avenue,
Right.
stretching from El Camino and going westward.
Right, all the way up at the top end to where the old HP building used to be, and then became the first location for Facebook after they moved out downtown, and then was a temporary headquarters for Theranos before they moved over to Pagemill Road.
Okay.
Is that the area that's typically the 1601? Is that 1601 California? Is that the one that is of most concern to you at this point?
Yes.
And TCEs, what effects do they have on humans? Why are they dangerous?
Well, it has been classified by the EPA, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, as a carcinogen. There are known health risks. They generally occur when the vapors that come up from the gas, the TCE, which is a vapor, comes up out of the ground, gets trapped in an enclosed space. And that's why, for instance, the Palo Alto Stanford playing fields, which has TCE underneath, is considered okay because it dissipates into the air and then gets dispersed, and it's not a threat. And therefore, one of the mitigation that's planned on the 1601 California Avenue site, the former HP building, is that the area of highest concentration would not have any houses on it and would stay as an open field.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about that because initial thought of having vapors come up while people are playing soccer and breathing it in doesn't sound like a really great idea. But so you're saying that the main concern is if it's trapped within a house, for example, and it just...
Initially, it sounds like it's a concern. I thought, my God, we're on open field with TC coming up.
Right.
But, and I'm not a technical expert, but from everything that we've read and the consultants that we have and the people that we've spoken to, it is an issue when it's trapped within an enclosed space, whether either residential or even in commercial buildings, and it comes up into that environment, and there's long-term exposure, or to women who are pregnant in the first trimester, even higher elevations can be a problem. There was an incident recently, well, I'd say in the last couple of years, at a Google site in Mountain View, which is over a TCE location, and they have kind of fans in the garage that are supposed to clear the air out and dissipate it. They went off for a certain period of time, and it was reported as an issue, that kind of a thing. But it's when it becomes into an enclosed space
The
for
concentration builds
a
up.
long period of time, or shorter periods of time at elevated levels in the first trimester.
There's been also a lot of discussion about mitigation versus and remediation, and maybe we could explain a little bit about the two of those in a little bit. But one thing I was wondering about is the State Department of Toxic Substances Control and Stanford say that, for example, they claim that some of those areas have already been dug out, so the TCE is supposedly taken out of the area. However, if TCE is, let's say, you've gotten the major bulk of it out of the soil, what's the difference? But you still got vapors, so that means it's still there, right? I mean, what's kind of the difference?
Well, TCE doesn't really cling to the soil, such as another hazardous material that was on the 1601 side called PCB, polychlorobiphenyl, which does cling to the soil, and Stanford dug up, trucked out 1,500 tons of it and replaced it with other soil. The TCE is kind of in the vapors, in the pores that are, between the kind of grains of soil, and it's elevating out of the ground into vapors, soil gas. That's the problem. Another problem is, where is it? Is it just stuck in the soil, or does it get down into an aquifer? So I've learned a lot about aquifers in recent years. There is a well-known established hazardous materials site at HP location on Pagemill Road, which has been under remediation for probably a couple of decades. And there are monitoring wells over in Research Park on the other side of Pagemill Road at Peter Coutts Village, and actually a few wells over on the 1601 site. But as I've learned, there actually are different groundwater levels, and that one is 250 feet down. And there's been mitigation going on for how you treat groundwater, which is try to extract it through kind of like charcoal filtering over periods of time. And the wells on 1601 that have been known about have been decommissioned a few years ago. So this, what we have now, is a new discovery of what is an old spill. And if it is in the groundwater, which is being disputed, is at a much shallower groundwater level than what happened over on the other side of Pagemill Road.
Yeah, this discovery
Complicated.
last year. Yeah, there's a lot to keep track of. But the discovery kind of launched this saga, this kind of back and forth between the neighborhood, and with concerns from the residents, obviously, about how is this affecting us? Could there be vapors coming up through our houses, which we don't know about? Can you sketch out a little bit just the action points from when the discovery was made, how you folks
Sure.
found out about it, and what's been going on back and forth between
Right.
you and Stanford?
So the Mayfield project is the one that I had been involved in since its inception when it came to the city in 2004.
The soccer field.
Through the development of the soccer field, which was the front end of the agreement. Then the back end was to build 250 units of housing, 70 below market rate in El Camino, which are well underway, and then 180 units for Stanford junior faculty up at the top of the hill in College Terrace, adjacent to California Avenue. The first-time housing would be built in the Research Park. It had to come for review 2 years ago at the city for kind of final overview. There were supposed to be environmental studies at the time. There was some indication that there might be something on the HP site. But the project not only moved forward, but it moved forward in phases, where the bottom half of the project, 8.5 acres, went ahead and building began. And then the demolition of the HP, Facebook Theranos building came later. Lo and behold, when it was torn down and they pulled up the concrete slab, they found the two hazardous materials, the PCB being trucked off. The TCE, you can't do it that easily. But we have a situation now where half the project's been well underway for over a year. The other half remains an open field. And we were finally notified around November of last year, probably around the time that Stanford had to disclose that there's an issue to people who might be prospective buyers, of the site, that there's a problem. And the problem goes to the regional oversight agency to decide, which in this case is the Department of Toxic Substances Control.
Okay.
There is another board called the Regional Water Quality Control Board that overlooks other sites in the research park. So we kind of have a mix of parcel by parcel here,
Oh, okay.
which is different than other locations. But in any event, DTSC, Department of Toxic Substance Control, is the oversight agency where Stanford and its consultants provide their plan for remediation and or mitigation. They can remediate the PCB by trucking it out. TCE was more complicated because it's not really linked into
Clinging
the
to
soil.
the-
To the
yeah,
soil.
soil.
What do you do? Is it in the groundwater? Isn't it? And those considerations. So
Yeah.
And just
that's
for
so then we found out.
just for
Yeah.
clarification, the difference between mitigation and remediation.
Good question. A remediation means you either truck out the soil, you treat the soil. Those are what I would consider. Mitigation means you move things away, you put in protective mechanisms within the housing. Although
But you leave the substances there. You leave the toxic.
you leave the substances there. Although Stanford has said that we've said, why don't you take the stuff out of here? Why don't you remediate it? And they said, well, we are in a sense. We've taken out where the sources are. We've taken out where the plating sump was, the current storage chemical area is gone. All of the underground conduits, sewer pipelines, that's all gone, which has been a problem in Mountain View where it actually kind of traveled through the sewer lines somewhere else. We've taken out all that infrastructure, so we've done that. Whether that's full remediation or not, I don't know. Whether that is whether full remediation is possible or practical is under debate.
Yeah. And just to outline some of the things that Stanford says would work would be putting new soil on top to 15 feet, I believe, so 12 to 15 feet over certain areas where there's high concentrations, and then, as you said already, taking out the actual sources of TCE or possible TCE transmittal, correct, in this buffer zone that they said would be adequate, not building on those parcels. But the neighborhood has engaged your own kind of expert to weigh in on the adequacy of mitigation and remediation. And what have they been agreeing with Stanford, or have they been critiquing in certain ways?
Well, Stanford filed what's called a risk assessment with the Department of Toxic Substance Control. That becomes a public document that finally we got to see the evaluation from their consultant on the extent of the problem and what what they think should be done about it. So we read that finally. We had a lot of questions and issues, and we wanted to be able to get them answered. The Department of Toxic Substance Control actually sent a delegation down of 4 people to meet with 5 of us in the neighborhood. We have 2 scientists in the neighborhood. One works at NASA, another one's a retired research chemist. And we also have an outside consultant who is an expert in vapor intrusion, who was working and supporting us in our efforts. So we all met with Department of Toxic Substances Control in Palo Alto. Stanford was present. At that point, we were able to get a lot of technical questions, answered or responded to. And then based on that meeting, we were then allowed the opportunity to respond back with follow-ups.
Okay.
So we have since now got our ducks all in a row, responded back at the end of January with a report from our neighborhood, a report from the consultant that was submitted into the Department of Toxic Substances Control. And we received a response back 2 weeks ago, about 6 weeks after. And in a nutshell, they're basically saying everything's okay the way Stanford has planned it.
Okay.
Or basically Stanford has written, I assume their consultant has revised its work, responded to the questions that we've had, said there's no need for any further change, and DTSC, it seems to be in agreement.
Okay. Now, I think there are some issues that you have with that response, that not you personally, I mean, you as the group of neighborhood residents.
Right. One thing I want to mention is that in terms of the mitigations that are being done, what Stanford has proposed is that there be a 50-foot buffer zone around the area of highest concentration. That would become an open space. There'd be no housing built on it. Roads would be realigned around it, houses would be moved aside. That's all they have to do. They say, we're going to do more. We're going to put extra dirt on top of that mound. We're going to put vapor barriers under the homes. We're going to do some other mechanisms. The response from our consultant, or the initial statement from our consultant, is 50 foot isn't enough. In Mountain View, we do 100.
100-foot
100 is the 100 is the practice in Mountain View for some years. And in terms of what you're doing with the houses, we have a different process that we use that is a state-of-the-art kind of subsurface depressurization system that should be built into the houses. And that's also part of one of their recommendations in those kind of situations where the vapors then kind of go out the sides of the building.
The vapor barriers and kind of basic vapor barriers that Stanford's recommending or would like to do is kind of a material, a plastic material of some sort.
It's a blocking material underneath, the foundation or under the slab of the home.
And your consultant, who we should mention, is the Center for
Center for Public
CEO.
Environmental Oversight, CPEO.
Yes, and involves Lenny Siegel, who's a Mountain View City Council person. So this other technique would actually sort of pipe out the vapors from underneath into the
Yes.
Into the air.
It would have a depressurization which kind of move it out to the side and then
And up and out.
up and out, rather than involve any risks if the vapor barrier was punctured in any way, and would be a better process
And
in
is
his
there-
view.
And do we even know what the life expectancy of the vapor barrier would be before it breaks down?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
But assuming that everything does sort of have a shelf life, and there might be
It may
some-
have a shelf life. The critique in the Mountain View situation or in that procedure is that this is a better process. This is the state of the art on how to handle this. So I want to mention briefly about Lenny Siegel. The fact that he's on the Mountain View City Council is incidental, which I think he just recently elected about a year ago. The main issue is that he's been following the issue of hazardous materials back through the 60s when the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition was around, and he is an expert in this area of vapor intrusion. He is not a technical or scientific expert, but this particular field he's been studying.
He's been studying for decades then.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Groundwater, I think, was another issue that you raised, and none of us are technical experts, but the DTSC came back saying that there was little to no chance that any vapors would actually get into either an aquifer or groundwater, storm water. And I wanted to find out from you whether that was reassuring, whether that is something that you still have some skepticism over, or what's the issue right now?
Well, the issue is that you have a spill or spills in a building that has spread about 300 feet from what we know for sure. And how did it do that? So there are, and here you get into kind of like, I think the word is lithology, what the soil is like underneath, where you have groundwater, where you have some things that are called perched water, which is not groundwater, but is permeable, the kind of granularity of the soil, whether it blocks it at certain points, it doesn't. So the conclusion of the Stanford consultant is that it is contained, the spill, within the defined area.
But you still have a question, I understand, about the migration that hasn't been explained?
Well, we're concerned that, number one, we don't think that the flow of TCE respects parcel boundaries, and nor does it respect California Avenue. So we want to be sure that we're safe in our neighborhood and nothing is coming to the houses where we don't have vapor barriers at all, and they're older homes. And also, there's been some, part of the critique was that the standards that are being used in the model that comes up with the 50-foot limit is generous in regard to other places. So US EPA has a standard, Cal EPA, DTSA has a different one. What you put in as what's called the attenuation factor how you change the number as distance goes changes versus on now what the soil is like.
Okay.
So that's kind of like a bit of a black box, so you can try to read if you want to.
Yeah.
So there's that whole, we want to be able to test, we want to be able to know for sure that in College Terrace, that the level of soil vapor is below a minimal standard
Sure.
that we feel comfortable with. And therefore, since Stanford is not going to do additional testing, or said they won't, and feels that what they have tested is adequate to protect us, we are going to hire a consultant who's going to come and do testing within our homes.
So you'll take this on as a neighborhood?
We will take it on
yourselves?
for those people who want to have the testing done in that area. We're going to have testing.
And one of the things that came out of Lenny Siegel's report as well was he said that the testing that was done regarding the site was done during a period of drought, so you might not really have a good sense of how these chemicals, or this chemical in particular, is moving through the soil or moving into or near or
Right.
being transported
Right.
by water. And so is this something that is still of concern to you as well?
Well, again, it's the idea that the groundwater can rise and fall depending upon the drought level. There's two concerns. One is the concern: what are we as neighbors? What is the safety level with regard to our neighborhood, which is further away than the people who will be living on the site. On the other hand, we feel we have a responsibility to the folks who are going to be looking at purchasing homes on that site. And so the question is being asked, do you have it adequately defined that this is the area, that there will be no further travel? And we don't think those questions have been adequately answered, which is why we're responding with, if the standard mountain view is 100 feet, why not here?
So I have another question about the border and the testing wells that you had requested. How far away in number of feet is the border on California Avenue, border of this property, from College Terrace, from, like, say, the nearest College Terrace house?
It's across the public right-of-way city strip on either side of the street, and California Avenue in the middle.
Okay, and
We are neighbors.
Okay.
College Terrace and University Terrace will be joined at the hip of California Avenue.
Okay, and so how far away is the nearest monitoring well? So I guess I'm trying to see, what's the point closest to College Terrace for the monitoring?
There are no monitoring wells. They did drilling samples over various periods of time. So the analysis covers samples from different times in the past. There are some that were near the edge. We are concerned that the detection level was not fine-grained enough for our purposes, as one aspect of it.
And that's of the drilling? Where
They took, basically what they did is they drilled in over time at maybe 50 or 60 areas around the site. When they drill, they go in it, they take samples at different depths, assuming they can get a sample. So you've got anything from 5, 10, 25, 30 feet, they pull that out. Then you put that together into a table or a chart and try and figure out what's happening, which is tricky. And that's why one of the things that we did is we created a model that was more visual to kind of show where we thought the spread was going. But anyway, we had wanted additional testing at the edge. Stanford doesn't want to do it, so we're not going to do drilling on our side. We're going to do in-home vapor testing.
Right.
From an official standpoint, then, you've received the DTSC report. Are you going to go back to them? Are you going to go back to Stanford with the idea of 100-foot buffer, and the
Well,
presentation?
we'll continue to do our critique. I think it seems to be the DTSC. We asked DTSC, hey, can we give further input now? Do we get a chance
What's
to
the
respond?
process? Sure.
Or is it going to be a waste of time?
Yeah.
And the indication seemed to be that the direction is going that they're going to continue with their process, where Stanford files another report to them. There has to be covenants, codes, and restrictions that are applied to the property that have to go out for public comment, which would include, don't make any changes to the park area, don't puncture any vapor barriers, things that cannot be done to the property. And then, after all that's done, it does have to return to the city council for new approval, because the configuration of the site is changing.
Right, the site planning.
And whether the city council has any authority in regard to mandate at this point that they put in additional mitigation, stronger mitigations, I don't know.
So,
But they do, I'm sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
they do, so the DTSC can approve the Stanford plan, but that doesn't mean that the city government cannot concurrently or contemporaneously have their own rules. For instance, over at CPI, in Communications Power Industry, which is adjacent to Barron Park, 10 years ago, it was under the control of a state regulation because the level of hazardous materials on that site was so high it couldn't be monitored locally. Well, at that time, there was absolutely no law on the books that said you can't have such a facility backdoor to a neighborhood. Now,
Right.
we do have rules that relate to that. So, it's something that hopefully the council and the city will look at in terms of what is the best practices in Palo Alto for situations like this. It may come up again. Housing is hard to find.
Yeah.
Research Park might be a good place for more and others. And
Yeah.
why should Mountain View have something better than we have?
Well, there's something to goose the city council. I wanted to pivot, if it's okay, just real quick
Sure.
to the parking issue, because there are a number of neighborhoods within Palo Alto that want a quote-unquote College Terrace style permit parking program. College Terrace has had the only permit program for the longest time until Crescent Park got a little program for overnight parking. What is so special about the College Terrace parking program, and how is it working out, actually?
Well, it's working very well. First of all, it's a tribute to the people who pressed for it over a decade ago to get it started. It came through mitigations funds out of the Stanford General Use Permit to pay for a study, which then happened, and then continued effort to kind of get implemented. It's working very well. We're supposed to be revenue neutral. We haven't heard that we aren't at this point. You pay
Essentially, residents have the parking permits, but no one else does. Is that correct?
Right, it's not structured the way where businesses have it at this point. And I don't know if there'll be, active movement to change College Terrace in any way. On the other hand, it's working very well. We have like over 90% acceptance. It's kind of democracy in action in the sense that every year you have the opportunity as a block meaning two sides of the street, okay, across the neighborhood, to decide whether you want to stay in or get out. If you want to get out, you can petition the city, and if you have a majority that petitions the city, you then get a postcard where you get to vote and you can go out. And when that happens, there is like intense lobbying among neighbors and neighbors next door who says, now it's going to come over to my block.
Right.
Until, documents are written, communication happens until there's an adjudication. So we have a very, very high acceptance rate we have to this point. It was foresighted on the part of people who were in the neighborhood. It was pushed along by, not only by the initial problem, which was folks at Stanford parking in the neighborhood when parking permits on Stanford were cheap, and you could park all day here and just drive your bike there, but then also with the impact of Facebook moving into College Terrace in the building we're talking about, as well as another one, and a huge, tremendous impact when you take a building that is made for research and development and suddenly gut it into people working at cubicles. No cubicles, people working in open spaces, card tables.
Right.
So that helped kind of put the fear of God in people, and we all signed up, and it's been working pretty well.
Okay, great.
Very well, I would say.
Yeah. I understand that the folks in Evergreen Park, which is across the street
Right.
from College Terrace, feel like they are influenced by or affected by the same types of commuters that College Terrace used
Sure.
to be, and are now trying to deal with that situation.
Right, plus they have people who want to park if they're going to the train station.
Or closer to the
There are other who are coming downtown, so it's a citywide issue. It's more difficult in certain areas, and I'm glad the city's working on it. I know people who've been involved in our parking permit program have been in communication with our neighborhoods in terms of what we're doing. And so, just speaking for myself, very supportive of the efforts to make parking manageable throughout residential neighborhoods in town.
Okay. Well, great. I think we need to wrap it up for this
Okay.
week. But Fred Balin, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank
and
you.
Telling us a little bit more about underground toxics and College Terrace.
Appreciate it.
That's all the news for this week for our webcast. If you want to keep up to date with what's happening in Palo Alto, you can go to paloaltoonline.com. If you want to comment on any of the stories that we are covering or ones that you'd like us to cover, you can go to paloaltoonline.com/square. That's it for this week.